As I make my way home, I can feel the familiar throbbing pain of another migraine settling in. The doctors at the VA have attributed these headaches to the metal plate in my head, a reminder of my time in combat. I'm skeptical of their diagnosis. After all, the plate has been there for a decade, and these headaches only started about 5 months ago. Coincidentally, this timing aligns with my wife Sue's new job as a receptionist at a local law firm, a decision that I reluctantly supported but now deeply regret. Let me introduce myself. My name is Bobby Turner, a former Marine who served for 4 years in the 1960s. I was injured by a mortar shell during my service, which left me with a plate in my skull. After a long recovery filled with hospital stays and rehabilitation, I returned to my family farm. The transition wasn't easy, but I managed to secure disability benefits. However, the compensation was insufficient to cover all my living expenses, prompting me to further my education and eventually become a heavy equipment operator for the county. Now, I operate a grader and a backhoe, which I keep in a barn behind our house. Typically, my days consist of repairing and maintaining the county's sand roads, but today was different. I had to sit through a classroom session for 2 hours, covering new regulations from federal, state, and county offices. Given my medical condition, I felt a wave of fatigue wash over me, and my boss, understanding my situation, allowed me to leave early. Despite my long-standing condition, I believe my headache stemmed from something deeper than the physical implant in my head. 6 months ago, Sue expressed a desire to return to work. Initially, I resisted this idea. After all, the farm and the house were inherited from my late father, and our financial situation was stable enough for her not to work. Nevertheless, I relented, and she took a job at the law office. I cautioned her about Paul, the son of the firm's founder, whom I had known since school. He was charming, wealthy, and notoriously known as a womanizer. In high school, he often boasted about his romantic exploits and paraded around with an air of confidence that only wealth could afford. Now, while I was off fighting in the war, he was attending college, and upon my return, I found him well established as a lawyer. Meanwhile, I had to contend with the lingering effects of my injuries and the plate in my head. Last night, Sue and I had yet another argument. I wanted to start a family, but she insisted on waiting. When pressed for a timeline, she became evasive, avoiding eye contact. This behavior fueled my suspicions that something was amiss in our relationship. Let me tell you a bit about Sue. We met 4 years ago when she was working as a receptionist at a factory. She had experienced relationships before, and so had I. Both of us came with some history, but that never bothered me. After a year of dating, I proposed, and she eagerly accepted. Sue had always dreamed of living in the countryside, tending to a garden and owning horses, a life I gladly provided for her. Our first years together were idyllic. I bought her 2 horses, and we spent weekends exploring the forests. However, things began to change when she insisted on working. Although I sensed that something was off, I couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was. I'm 6 feet tall, weigh about 190 pounds, and try to keep myself fit. I consider myself to be reasonably good-looking. Sue is 5 feet 8 inches, around 115 pounds, with blonde hair and blue eyes, attractive and charming. We drive nice vehicles, with me owning a Ford truck. As I approach our farm today, the feeling of disturbance intensifies. I turn the corner and see the unmistakable blue Corvette belonging to Paul parked outside our house. A rush of anger and anxiety courses through me, and I can't help but think this might be the reason behind my growing unease. I cut the engine, my heart pounding, and reach for the 1911 Colt .45 in the glove compartment, chambering around. Today is the day the situation needs to be resolved. As I enter through the side door and make my way toward the den, I notice a letter addressed to me sitting on the coffee table. Curiosity gets the better of me, and I pick it up to read. The message is from Sue, and its contents hit me like a punch to the gut. Bobby, I want you to know that I once truly loved you, and I am sorry about all this, but it is what it is. I met Paul about 8 months ago while shopping at the mall in Memphis. He took me to lunch, and we had a few drinks. All those stories about his physical attributes intrigued me. We ended up at a Radisson, and I was hooked. When the job opening came up at his office, he got me hired. We spent a couple of days a week being intimate either in his office or at his home. Those late nights and Sunday afternoon shopping trips were spent with him, and we fell in love. Now, he has to go to Miami to deal with a client, and he invited me to go with him. When we get back, I will file for divorce and move my things into his house. We will be gone for about a week, so that will give you time to cool down. I know how hot-headed you can be at times. I am really sorry to hurt you like this, and I truly did love you. Please try to understand. As I read her words, rage and heartbreak swirl within me. Sue is about to learn just how hot-headed I can be, and she will soon understand that I will never accept a betrayal that has shattered my world. I'm standing quietly at the bedroom door, peering in to find Paul on top of my wife, Sue, lost in their intimate moment. The anger bubbles up inside me, and I tap the barrel of my .45 against the doorframe to announce my presence. They both look up in shock. Paul scrambles off Sue, panic etched across his face as he realizes what's unfolding. "Bobby, you scared the hell out of me. Put that gun down and we'll get dressed and leave," he stutters, his smirk replaced by fear. I ignore him, directing my focus solely on Sue. "Shut up, Paul. Just stand there while I talk to my wife," I command, my voice steady, though my heart races. "You're not going to shoot anyone," Paul retorts, trying to regain some composure. In a surge of frustration, I fire a shot over his head, the bullet embedding itself into the wall with a deafening bang. The sound echoes through the room, filling it with tension. "Bobby, please. Just let us leave. I'll divorce you and won't ask for anything. Just let us go," Sue pleads, her voice a mixture of desperation and fear. I glance at the letter I read earlier in the den, the one that revealed their betrayal. It was clear that this was all about Paul's ego and his so-called Big Johnson, a phrase that irked me more than anything else. I shift my gaze to Paul, who's grinning at the chaos unfolding, a reaction that only fuels my anger. With deliberate aim, I point my gun just above his exposed groin. The moment I pull the trigger, everything escalates. The bullet strikes and Paul screams in agony, his hands instinctively clutching at his injury. The pain must have been unbearable. He falls to his knees beside the bed, blood pooling beneath him as he begins to vomit, remnants of his hearty breakfast splattering the floor. He rolls onto his side, mumbling incoherently about my ancestors, perhaps in a pathetic attempt to absolve himself or find comfort in his final moments. Meanwhile, Sue is frozen, her knees drawn up to her chest as she watches in horror. "You read the letter?" she finally asks, her voice trembling. "Yes," I reply, unable to hide the bitterness in my tone. He made me put in that line about his Big Johnson, but it was the truth, wasn't it? "Bobby, please. I need an ambulance," Paul cries, his voice cracking. "No, you don't. You need a grave," I reply coldly, pulling the trigger again. The bullet finds its mark in his left eye, and the gruesome aftermath splatters against the wall behind him. The room falls into an eerie silence as Sue stares at me, disbelief painted across her features. "Bobby, please. I never gave you sloppy seconds. I always had an excuse to avoid you. I didn't want you to find out about us." She rushes to explain, her tone desperate, as if she believes that her words can somehow sway my decision. I simply smile at her, a chilling response that seems to confirm her worst fears. "Thanks for clarifying," I say, and before she can react, I pull the trigger one last time. The bullet strikes her forehead, ending her pleas and leaving her motionless. Afterward, I wrap their lifeless bodies in sheets from the bed, a grim task that feels surreal. I place them together in the passenger seat of Paul's Corvette, a car I now associate with their betrayal. As I search for his keys in his pants pocket, I find them and rev the engine, my mind racing with the weight of what I've done. Driving out behind the barn, I take them far enough from sight, ensuring no one will stumble upon the aftermath of my rage. The barn looms in the distance, a silent witness to my actions. I clean up the room, opening windows to air out the stench of vomit and fear. I gather paper towels and clothes, stuffing them into a garbage bag before throwing it on top of the bodies in the car. Once I'm sure everything is in order, I head to the barn and start the backhoe. Within 2 hours, I've buried their bodies and covered them up, the weight of their absence pressing heavily on my conscience. I decide against saying any words over their grave. I know the devil has no interest in the lies I might utter. Returning to the house, I dial the sheriff's office. Sheriff Parker answers, and I explain that I discovered a letter revealing my wife's infidelity with that attorney, Paul. I ask for his advice, trying to keep my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Bobby, call a divorce attorney and get things rolling. When they get back, serve them. It's best to get out in front of things like this, he advises, completely unaware of the true extent of what I've just done. After hanging up, I call an attorney in the next county, my mind still reeling as I try to navigate the aftermath of the night's horrific events. The next day, I made an appointment with the attorney to discuss the situation regarding Sue and Paul. I brought the letter with me, and the attorney made copies to keep on file. Since it was in Sue's handwriting, it would serve as evidence in my case. She assured me that all the necessary divorce papers would be ready when Sue and Paul returned, but I knew it was a long shot at this point. After the meeting, I returned home and packed up all of Sue's belongings in plastic garbage bags. I set the bags beside her car in the garage, a grim reminder of what had transpired. The next day, I resumed my work grading roads in the county, trying to keep my mind focused on the mundane tasks. Life as I knew it was beginning to return to normal, at least on the surface. However, a week passed without any sign of Sue or Paul. Then, about 10 days later, I began receiving calls from the law office. They wanted to know if I had heard from my wife. I didn't have any answers for them, only frustration that they would check in when they were the ones involved in this mess. Then, about 2 weeks after Sue and Paul had vanished, the sheriff's office sent a detective to take my statement. I directed him to my attorney, knowing that any conversations I had should be through her. I showed the detective all of Sue's belongings sitting by her car, a silent testament to her absence. After that meeting, I never heard from the detective again. A month went by, and I was still trying to piece my life together when federal agents unexpectedly showed up one evening after work. They had some intriguing questions for me. "Do you know Jose Gonzalez?" one of the agents asked. "No. Should I?" I replied, confusion mingling with unease. "How about Emmanuel Gonzalez?" he continued. "No, I don't know him either. What is this all about?" I pressed, my heart racing at the direction this conversation was heading. The agent explained that Paul had been on his way to meet Jose in Miami. Jose was the father of Emmanuel, a man Paul had represented in a drug trafficking case the previous year. During that trial, Paul had made a significant mistake by asking a question he didn't know the answer to, which led to a series of complications for Emmanuel. As a result, Emmanuel was found guilty and sentenced to 50 years in federal prison. Now, Jose wanted Paul to represent his son in an appeal, but that should have been a red flag for Paul. The agent told me that Jose wired $100,000 to Paul's law firm, asking him to come to Miami to discuss the case since he was too ill to travel. Apparently, Paul believed he would earn even more money from this big appeal, completely ignoring the danger he was stepping into. To my shock, Paul decided to take Sue with him on this trip. They fueled up Paul's Corvette in town, and we knew this because he used his credit card. After that, they picked up Sue and headed for Miami. The agent speculated that after leaving town, they never stopped for gas or food, suggesting that something had happened to them before they could. Their inquiry turned darker when they mentioned Jose. He had gone to hospital about a week after Sue and Paul disappeared, and he died 6 days later. We never got the chance to question him about it, the agent said, frustration evident in his voice. Well, I guess that means I can finally get rid of all her stuff, I replied, feeling an unsettling relief wash over me. It's all in garbage bags in the garage. You're welcome to look through it if you want. The agents waved off my offer, stating it wouldn't be necessary. They requested a copy of the letter Sue left behind for their files. I agreed and handed over the letter, watching as they left my house. That was over 30 years ago, and since that day, I haven't felt any disturbances in my life. The weight of what I had done to Sue and Paul was buried deep, just like their bodies, under what is now my hog pen.